Hi, welcome to this short video about introducing and analyzing quotes. So one of the things you're going to notice when you look at the essay checklist for this particular essay is that a lot of what I'm looking for, I'm going to be evaluating your work on, is how you use evidence, in this case quotes from the narratives and pieces of literature that we've been reading. So what I'm looking for is that the analysis of your text is insightful, and that you have developed and supported your ideas with evidence and quotes. So you can try to think about including 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, either paraphrases or quotes, in each body paragraph so that you're really developing your ideas. And then for the quoting itself, introducing the quotes, and that the analysis after the quotes is really specific and thoughtful, and that there's not too many quotes, good balance of your own words and quotes, and no body paragraphs that ends with quotes. So we're going to go into a little more detail about that. So just as a recap for MLA, you always want to cite quotes in the body of your essay. Even for this essay where you might only be writing about Baca's coming into language for your entire essay, every time you have a quote, you still want to include Baca and the page number. It's just a good habit to get into. So an example here with the signal phrase, the author's last name, present tense verb, page number. You could also have the author's last name and the page number in parentheses. So each time you have a quote, include that author's last name. So here is a quote that kind of has a problem. We have the author's last name, we have our present tense verb states, and we have our page number. So what's the problem? So the issue with the following is, when I read this quote, as your reader, I want to be reminded a little bit about the context of this quote. So in the text coming into language, what's happening when this quote appears? So you can go ahead and just include a little bit of detail. So actually this quote is about the effects of solitary confinement. So you could just use a short phrase before the quote. Baca describes the negative effects of solitary confinement. As the months passed, I became more and more sluggish. My eyelids were heavy. I could no longer read or write. I slept all the time. So when you're introducing, you want to give your reader any background information that they need to understand the quote. And in this case, you're thinking about me and your classmates as your reader. People who have read the text but might need a little bit of a refresher about what's happening in that particular quote. And then you're going to include the quote. And then when you analyze, you want to comment on the importance or the meaning of the quote. So in other words, we might have a fairly short quote, but your words on both sides. So you're really guiding the reader through the quote. You're setting it up for them, telling them what to notice, and then in your analysis, it's a really clear why you chose the quote. So you picked that quote out of this larger text for a reason, and in your analysis, you want to really make sure your reader understands why you chose that quote and not some other quote. So what in particular was important or noteworthy about that quote? So for introducing quotes, you can use a short phrase called a signal phrase. We already talked about this, where you just have the last name and a verb. Baca explains. Coates speculates. Or you can use a complete sentence with a colon. Baca describes the negative effects of solitary confinement, colon, and then we have our quote. Through becoming a poet, the narrator is able to redeem his own past and to confront the injustice he has endured. Colon, and then your quote. And this just really sets up the context. And then as another option, you could incorporate the quote into your own sentence structure. So you can have some of your own words and then just a snippet or a small bit of the quote. A lot of you have already done this really well in your Canvas assignments where you're just responding to the reading. So I know a lot of you are familiar with doing this, but just as a refresher, Baca refuses to become cynical and uses his voice as a writer to celebrate his own resiliency. So those are my own words, and then I have the quote. And to affirm the breadth and laughter and the abiding innocence of things. So that's a really great option, and I'd like you to try to experiment with that a bit if you haven't already. And if this is something you already do, great, keep doing that. It's excellent. Here's another example Reflecting on the way her relationship with alcohol progressed, the narrator explains that drinking was an evolution that became more desperate over time. So I've set it up with some of my own words and then moved directly into the quote. So what you want to think about with the after your quote is adding a lot of analysis. And what that can be is your opportunity to really drive home your message, connect back to your thesis, tell your reader why the quote proves your interpretation of the text. Some of you may have heard of the C paragraph. It's a useful acronym. Just the S, the first S is statement. So your topic sentence for that paragraph, and then your evidence is quotes, and your explanation is the commentary that explains or analyzes the way the textual evidence you've chosen supports your main idea. And when you're commenting after a quote, you really want to choose something specific about the quote to comment on. So here's an example of analysis after the quote being not great. So Zalka supports this in saying, I grew into my abuse like an occasional tree you find on a nature walk, its roots spilling over both sides of the boulder like outspread fingers, in spite of the rock's lack of soil, moisture, and stability. This shows how using alcohol negatively impacted her. So that bold sentence after the quote, that's really weak analysis. And one of the reasons as a teacher I would say that analysis is weak is you could put that sentence after almost any quote in the narrative smashed, and that sentence would work. So that just shows me that that sentence is not talking specifically about that quote. It's just very general about the text. So we really want to tell the readers why that quote in particular was worth including. So this is from Jacob's essay, the example essay on Smashed. Same quote, and he wrote, this vivid description paints the picture that Zalkis did not choose a suitable support system or foundation to build the rest of her life upon. So he's pointed out two things. He's pointed out that the author uses vivid language to paint a picture. So that's good because he's commenting on the author's style. And then he's also, instead of just saying alcohol is negative, he's saying that it is an unsound foundation. So it's really specific to the quote. It feels like it's adding something to the quote and directly responding to the quote. So what you want to think about is try to pick a specific word, image, or idea in the quote to put in your analysis and not make it overly general. So you could connect back to the author's larger message and just make it really clear how the quote supports your interpretation of the text. Here's another example of weak analysis. Urea depicts the nightly border roundups as a form of people hunting. He writes, monstrous dog trudge speeding in and out of the landscape. Uniformed men patrolling with flashlights, guns, and dogs, spotlights, running figures, lines of people hurried into buses by armed guards. This shows the hardship the immigrant has to go through. So again, that's really weak analysis because it's not really commenting on anything within the quote. So there's so many things that you could comment on in this quote. The idea of people hunting, which is dehumanizing, and also just the idea of the militarization of this, that we've got the patrol cars, the armed guards, the spotlights, or many other things that you could point out. So you want to think about, okay, well, what's worth commenting in that quote? Here is another one. So Urea shows that the process of leaving a hometown behind is emotionally taxing. So you've got a good lead into our quote. Urea writes, you said goodbye to the graveyard, the goat, the dog, the mountains where you first hunted, your grade school, your state, your favorite spot on the river where you fished and took time to think. This shows how much people leave behind. So the problem is with analysis, it's not really commenting on the quote. So you would just want to revise that, make it a little bit stronger. So here's an example of the revised. So here I'm pointing out something stylistically that he did and also the message. By tying specific memories to places, Urea paints a picture of loss. Leaving specific places which are tied to personal history and identity is a sacrifice. The repetition of "say goodbye to" reinforces the message that immigrants are not opportunistic but forced into leaving, often due to violence in their hometowns. So after that analysis, it's really clear what that quote's doing in the essay. Okay, putting it all together, I wanted to show you an example from Lena's essay in Student Voices on Letter to My Son. So let's go ahead and look at this whole thing. So we've got a really good lead into the quote, and then after the quote, we have great analysis. And what I want to point out is that the quote itself is taking up only part of her essay. She's using evidence, but it's mostly her own voice and her own words as a writer. And the quote itself is much less than her own words. So Coates writes to his son, listing the names of people whose lives have been taken by police officers. Their murders will see no justice, and these police officers will get away with murder. The destroyers will rarely be held accountable. Mostly, they will receive pensions. Coates. This passage highlights the ways in which his son and their communities are not serviced by the police, and how the laws they get paid to enforce are in place to protect oppressive systems. So really good analysis after the quote. So you can double check the essay checklist on Canvas, and that's it for the short video. Thank you.